Ragusa is a professor at the College of Charleston who's immersed in politics. Now he talks one-on-one with me about the recent presidential election and the future of the First and South politics for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Dr. Jordan Ragusa, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Obviously, you're a political science professor at the College of Charleston. And right behind you, I'm seeing you have the First and South political book, which you and Dr. Gibbs Knox co-authored a couple of months ago. And you sent me a copy, and I thank you so much for it. Now, I want to talk to you about, obviously, a course that you have here at the College of Charleston. And this is an article coming from the College of Charleston. The headline reads this: CC course explores Charleston role in political politics, written by Alicia Lutz. It says this, quote, "Sometimes you're just in the right place at the right time." And for Jordan Ragusa's first-year experience seminar on the unique role that Charleston and the College of Charleston have played in political politics throughout history, you can't do much better than right now and right here. What place are you right now in the political world?
Yeah, wow, that's a tough question to answer. I mean, it's really the million-dollar question. The course really focuses on the history of Charleston and the College of Charleston and presidential politics, and what we can learn about our past. And it seems like in every era of political history, it feels like there are these monumental things going on that are going to define politics for a generation. And sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not true. But I think that there's no doubt that right now we are in a pretty monumental era. Where are we going? What's going to happen over the next 4 years, over the next decade? There are lots of scenarios. I mean, I think the one that's of immediate importance is, is Joe Biden indeed going to be the next president? Every indication is that he is. But sort of more importantly, what does Donald Trump do over the next 4 years if Biden is indeed our president? And, people have speculated that he might start a media empire, that, maybe he aligns with an organization called OAN, One America News Network,
right.
That's kind of like a more conservative or more extreme version of Fox News. That's certainly a possibility. But one of the really interesting possibilities is that he basically decides that he's going to run for president again and spend the next 4 years or so campaigning for office. And of course, that would touch off not only a fight in the nation, but also within the Republican Party over what direction they want to go. So I think there's a lot of ways that the next 4 years could play out. But the big question is, what does Donald Trump do?
What is going on inside the Republican Party right now?
Yeah, I mean, so there are very serious questions about the future of the party, namely, what's its policy platform going to be over the next 4 years? I mean, you have some people that want to kind of double down on Trumpism, whatever that term means. Basically, let Donald Trump continue to be the party's standard bearer. Focus on things like, a strict immigration policy, focus less on international agreements, focus less on having our military involved in conflicts overseas, have these trade wars and things like that. But there is, a faction within the Republican Party that wants it to kind of return to its roots. What a lot of people often describe as, Reagan-era conservatism. And so that would be focusing on things like debts and deficits. During the Trump years with Republicans in charge, the debt has continued to increase. Some of that is not their fault. I mean, a lot of that is spending because of the pandemic and decreased revenue. But some of it certainly is. Of course, the Trump-era tax cuts contributed a lot to both deficits and the long-term debt. Someone like Mark Sanford has written a lot about returning to a focus on the fiscally conservative roots of the Republican Party. But beyond that, there is a discussion about, having a more lenient immigration policy, something that the Republican Party historically has stood for. And there's also that same faction often wants to talk about, having free trade and not getting into these trade wars with countries like China. So, parties are really Big Ten organizations. No matter what party and no matter what era, we see divisions within them. But I think that it is really acute in this time period. What direction does the Republican Party go in? I mean, Mark Sanford, obviously a former representative of the 1st Congressional District here in the Charleston area, is an important figure in that. But so is Nikki Haley. And, I think a lot of people thought that if Donald Trump lost, he might quietly step aside and, that might begin Nikki Haley's leadership of the Republican Party. It'll be interesting to see what happens. But consistent with the theme of the course, I mean, there are a lot of South Carolinians and even a lot of Charlestonians who are going to be an important part of the story.
There's so many questions to ask you about what you just mentioned. First, Nikki Haley. Obviously, she's the former South Carolina governor and obviously the former United States Union ambassador for the United States. And obviously, you hear all the comments on social media now that she's on the side of President Trump and that might hurt her. Will it hurt her in 2024?
I think Nikki Haley has probably done a better job than any other Republican of kind of straddling this fine line that Republicans have to straddle between being, close to Donald Trump. I mean, he obviously commands a lot of power within the party. He, better than anyone else, can kind of get the base energized. But at the same time, I think that Donald Trump is a polarizing figure. And so, there is a danger to being too closely aligned with Donald Trump. So I think she has done a good job of almost having it both ways. And I don't mean that to be dismissive of her. I think she's doing a good job of kind of straddling that line. So I don't see it hurting her too much. I think that she has, a record independent of Donald Trump that she can run on. So I don't think that it will hurt her going forward. Of course, if we have a 2024 Republican primary where people challenge Donald Trump, well, then she's in a tougher spot. Then she has to draw a clear line in the sand about, what she agrees with the president on and what she challenges him on. And that would be really fascinating because, of course, in the book, one of the arguments that Gibbs, Knotts, and I make is that the South Carolina primary is really important. We show that Southerners and neighboring state politicians have an advantage in the South Carolina primary. Presumably, that would advantage Nikki Haley. But, I still think that it is Donald Trump's party. And so if there was that primary fight, I mean, wow, it would be one for the ages. And I if it comes to that, I can't wait to see what happens.
And what other issues does she stand on right now?
Yeah, I mean, she has focused a lot on being a more moderate voice in the party on issues related to gender and race. People have been saying for, a decade or more that, the Republican Party needs to broaden its appeal beyond white men. And there's some interesting data that we see after the 2020 election that maybe Donald Trump actually did that a little bit. Trump actually did better among black males than he did in 2016. But, if the Republican Party does need to broaden its appeal, I think that you can't do better than Nikki Haley. I mean, obviously, she is a female, and she can help the party do better among female voters. She is obviously an Indian American, and that matters in future elections. She obviously helped with bringing down the Confederate flag in South Carolina after the shooting at the Mother Emanuel AME Church. And so, I think that she has kind of a moderate record, and, the symbolic importance of her potential candidacy would help her outside of the South and make her a very formidable opponent, in a presidential election. She also does have a lot of foreign policy experience.
Right.
Obviously, as the ambassador to the UN, that helped kind of check an important box in her record. When you look at potential presidential candidates, you want to see not only executive leadership, you want to see not only some domestic policy experience, but also some foreign policy experience. And so, she's not only checking boxes on demographic items, but she's checking boxes on both domestic and foreign policy chops. So again, I think that she is a very viable candidate for the Republican Party, whether it's 2024 or beyond. She will play an important role in the future of the party. There's no doubt about that in my mind.
Now, what boxes should the Democratic Party check off next for 2024?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a tough one to answer. I mean, going forward, of course, it will depend on Joe Biden, whether he decides he wants to serve a second term. I mean, there's been talk about him serving only one term. And if that's the case, I think that the path for the Democratic Party is, I think, a little clearer. They have broadened their appeal across demographics over decades, and that has paid dividends. I mean, Joe Biden got more votes than any presidential candidate in history. And so, I think you have waiting in the wings a very talented future presidential candidate in Kamala Harris. Of course, she's young, she's sort of vibrant, and she has an appeal to both women and African Americans, particularly African American females. A lot of people have written that the key to Joe Biden's success was African Americans in some of these key counties around the country. So one would be, Wayne County and Detroit, which, helped deliver Michigan for Joe Biden. And so, if Kamala Harris or any other Democrat can continue that momentum, I think it certainly helps the party going forward.
And what states will be key for Republicans in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, for better, for worse, I think the answer is the same for both parties. I mean, this electoral college thing that we have makes certain states pivotal in just about every presidential election. I mean, so one is Florida. The Republican Party has kind of solidified its grip on Florida in statewide and presidential politics. So, if they can continue to do well in Florida, that would help the Republican Party going forward. Of course, Democrats, have fertile ground to challenge in Florida, namely the state's large Hispanic and Latino electorate. Although what we know now is that Latinx voters are not a monolith, that Donald Trump really did very well with Cuban Americans, where a lot of people have said that the socialism messaging really worked and helped turn out Cuban voters for Donald Trump. So I think it's Florida for Republicans and Democrats alike. Republicans have kind of similarly solidified their grip on Ohio. Ohio has been kind of one of these states that decides elections in presidential politics. Of course, Ohio seems like this cycle it went against the national trend. But we'll see Pennsylvania being pivotal for both parties. Of course, Biden won that back from Donald Trump in 2016. Same thing with Michigan. Same thing with Wisconsin. Arizona is another state that I think both parties will be looking at in the future. Really, the interesting one for us in the South is Georgia. People have been talking about for decades whether Georgia is trending in the blue direction. And I think a lot of Democrats are very excited with the fact that it looks like Joe Biden has won Georgia, but one election does not make a state red or blue. And so I think that will be a battleground going forward. A lot of people ask, will South Carolina ever become blue? Potentially, but it's not happening anytime soon, as we saw from the recent election results.
Speaking of the Electoral College, is there anything stopping the Electoral College electors from voting or for a presidential candidate who did not win a state's votes?
In some states, yes. I mean, there are state laws that quote unquote bind their electors in the Electoral College and force them to vote for the winner of the popular vote. Now, I'm not an expert on this. I actually don't know a ton about it. I've heard some talk, though, that, the penalties aren't that great. And so an elector still can conceivably violate their state's laws on that. The more important thing, though, is that the electors in the Electoral College are typically party loyalists. They are people that are known quantities in their states. They're often state party leaders, prominent politicians, or just other leading political figures. And so it's very, very rare for the faithless elector to go against who they are supposed to vote for. So the short answer is there are state laws that deal with this matter, but I don't think that matters. We've seen historically the faithless electors are rare. So if there's talk about like Donald Trump potentially getting these faithless electors and that being his chance to hold on to the presidency, even though he lost the election, I don't see that happening. But I'm not an expert on that topic.
And going forward, who should write the election laws?
Well, under the Constitution, it is largely a state prerogative. If you look at the Constitution, the framers kind of gave the power to decide how elections are conducted to the individual states. It was a function of federalism and the fact that we were kind of a loose group of states in 1789. And so, of course, over time, there have been some national standards that Congress has passed. The most famous and obvious one is the fact that we have federal elections on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November.
Right.
That is because Congress passed a law making it so Congress could, conceivably tomorrow change it and make it, like a weekend or a Saturday, or make it a national holiday. But still, to this day, I mean, most of the regulations about our elections are decided by the states. It's why we have, this kind of complex set of recounts and complex set of procedures for counting votes that, drives people nuts. And, the answer to your question kind of hinges on what you prefer in a political system. And a lot of people are saying that Congress should create just one national set of routines about counting votes and other issues. But some people say, no, we still want our states to be kind of these, somewhat sovereign entities, that it's an important function of federalism that the states determine this issue. So I think the answer to your question just depends on your politics.
On your politics. Let me go back to what you said earlier. Obviously, there's still talk that, President Donald Trump may run in 2024. Isn't that the same path that Andrew Jackson took?
Good question. Yeah. I mean, so one of the things in this course on Charleston's role in presidential politics focuses on is, our range of individuals that have been pivotal in presidential politics that have some connection to either the College of Charleston or Charleston. So we talked about, obviously, John C. Calhoun.
Right.
We talked about John C. Fremont. But we talk about Andrew Jackson in the class. And so Andrew Jackson briefly spent some time during the Revolutionary War in Charleston. Famously, his brother died after the Battle of Stono Ferry, and his mother died in the Charleston area somewhere. We don't exactly know where her grave is, even to this day. But a lot of people have drawn parallels between Donald Trump and Andrew Jackson. And, some of those are positive and some of those are negative. But one of the things that Andrew Jackson did after 1824, when he lost to John Quincy Adams in a contingent election, is he claimed that there was this corrupt bargain that denied the people their voice. Of course, Andrew Jackson did win more popular votes than John Quincy Adams, and he had more electoral college votes as well, yet Quincy Adams became the president under the electoral college. So Jackson says, there was this corrupt bargain, and I'm going to run again in 1828. Not dissimilar from what many people think Donald Trump is going to do in 2021. Of course, the story is a monumental one. Jackson founds a new political party. It was called the Democratic Party. It's still the Democratic Party that we have today. And he won in 1828, and he fundamentally reshaped politics. And so could Donald Trump do that? I don't think it's unreasonable. In fact, I think that there's a good chance that something like that could occur.
Now, if he were to switch parties and become an independent, will that help him in 2024?
No, I don't think so. I think that, our two-party system is so firmly entrenched that it's hard for any independent candidate, even someone like Donald Trump, from running and winning. I think Trump's better course of action is to try to remake even more the Republican Party from within. Because what happens is that, if he runs as an independent, well, that means that the Republicans will almost certainly have their own candidate, and that's where, it could be like a Nikki Haley as kind of like a classic Republican or a non-Trump Republican. Could be, like a Mark Sanford trying to bring the party even closer back to, their Reagan conservatism roots. And I think that would split the party, and that would not be good from Donald Trump's standpoint, and it wouldn't be good from the standpoint of whatever Republican would challenge him. So no, I don't think it's advantageous for him to run as an independent.
Now, let me go over to the Democrats. What policies do they need to enact over the next 4 years to keep that particular seat in the White House?
Well, that's a good question. Unfortunately for Democrats and unfortunately for Joe Biden, I don't see them enacting a lot of legislation in the next Congress. Of course, in some ways, the Senate results were just as important, if not more important, than what happened in the presidential election. We have these two elections in Georgia that won't be decided until January.
Right.
But if Republicans hold on to those two seats, well, then Republicans hold on to their majority in Congress. It would take Democrats flipping both of those seats, which is a very heavy lift, despite the recent election result in Georgia, to then regain the Senate majority. But even if they get back to a tie, a 50-50 split in the Senate, which would give them control of the Senate, because, of course, the vice president of the United States is the president of the Senate, right, they would still have a tough time because of the filibuster. I mean, the filibuster is the linchpin of legislation in Congress. It is the thing more than anything else that kills landmark laws. And so Joe Manchin of West Virginia has already said, I am not going to vote to get rid of the filibuster, even if Democrats get to 50-50 and are able to control the chamber. And so what that means is that Republican senators will be able to do what minority party senators have been able to do for a long time, which is to block the majority in their attempt to pass landmark legislation. So I think it will be hard for Joe Biden and congressional Democrats to pass major pieces of legislation that they can then run on in 2024. Now, with that said, I think Biden's path to having a record that he can then run on in 2024 is through executive action. There are a lot of important pieces of executive actions that Trump undertook over the past 4 years that Biden can pretty quickly undo. One is rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, a very important action on climate change. Another would be reversing some of Trump's immigration policies, including, this policy of separating children from their parents at the border. There are a host of other things that the Biden administration can do via executive order that would be consequential, but it's not the major stuff like reversing the Trump era tax cut that passed in 2017, something that progressives within the Democratic Party really want to see done.
And how long will that actually take?
To potentially reverse the Trump era tax cuts? Well, that's an interesting question. I wrote a second book this year all about Congress's efforts to repeal legislation. It's somewhere over my shoulder next to the First in the South book.
Oh, yes.
But one of the key conclusions from that book is that repeals are incredibly difficult. It really takes a concerted effort by the majority party to undo legislation. And one of the reasons why is that, once a law is enacted, there are a lot of things that happen that kind of further entrench that law and make it difficult to reverse. So I don't see the Trump era tax cuts being repealed anytime soon. And the further along we go, the less and less likely they are to be repealed. I mean, the perfect example is the Affordable Care Act. I mean, Republicans ran for just about a decade on repealing the Affordable Care Act. They finally got their chance in the last Congress. and right before the midterm election. And what happened? John McCain and two other Republican senators voted no, and the repeal of the Affordable Care Act did not happen. They, of course, repealed this individual mandate in the Trump tax cut bill, but that's not what they really wanted to do, and it was a stinging failure. So reversing the Trump era tax cuts, I don't see it happening anytime soon, and the longer it holds on, the less likely it is to happen.
And what components of that Trump tax cuts act, if for lack of a better word, will President-elect Biden be successful with?
Yeah, I mean, well, there are two elements of the Trump era tax cut that a lot of Democrats and a lot of progressives have wanted to take on. One is a reduction in the corporate tax rate. I don't know the exact numbers off of my hand. It's not an area I'm an expert on, but it significantly reduced the amount of taxes that corporations pay. And, what I think I've heard a number of Democrats saying is that they don't want to totally repeal that because I think some agree that the corporate tax rate was too high, but they do want to bring it back up to an extent. So that's one aspect of the law. The more important one, though, is the reduction in taxes that wealthy Americans pay. And so, of course, Democrats and progressives prefer a more progressive tax structure where rich Americans pay a higher percentage of taxes than poor Americans. That is something that plays very well in public opinion polls. And so if Democrats could successfully repeal that aspect of the Trump era tax cuts, I think that it would help them with the American people writ large. I mean, look, for example, at Arizona. Arizona just passed via direct democracy a ballot measure that is going to increase taxes on the wealthy in order to pay for, I believe, either social services or education, and that passed, pretty overwhelmingly. And so I think that is the thing that Democrats would really focus on. But again, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
And you talk a lot about taxes. Let me take you to the first congressional district. Obviously, that was a hot topic during that particular race. What exactly do you see Nancy Mace accomplishing, that is, in 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are blessed here in the first congressional district to have really important elections in our backyard. I think we're also blessed to have, a competitive district where, moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans can run and win. And so, I think that Nancy Mace is probably going to try to achieve a lot of the same stuff that Joe Cunningham achieved. That is to serve on important committees in Congress that can do important work for the Low Country. So we have a lot of transportation and infrastructure concerns here in the Low Country. Obviously, we have concerns with flooding and the like. Obviously, we have a lot of veterans in the first congressional district. So serving on committees that can do good by veterans would be advantageous to Mace. Serving on committees that can deal with infrastructure and flooding, that will also do good by Mace. And so I think that's her path forward. There's a famous saying that's attributed to Tip O'Neill that all politics is local. Recently, what we've seen in Congress is that it doesn't seem like all politics is local. Politics is very nationalized, even in congressional races. But I think the first congressional district is a place where local politics still does matter. And I think that's something that Cunningham did very well. And I think that it's something that Nancy Mace almost certainly wants to achieve as well. But at the same time, focusing on issues like low taxes, increasing military spending, things that are classic national Republican issues will also be an important part of her repertoire going forward.
And what national Republican issues still affect the first congressional district?
Oh, I think a lot of them do. I mean, people still pay attention to, what the bottom line is on their 1040. When they pay their taxes, how much is going to the federal government, how much is going to the state government. I mean, that's still a national issue that Republicans talk about that plays well. I mean, I think military spending is still something that is very important here in the first congressional district. Again, we have a lot of veterans in the first congressional district. We have some important military bases throughout South Carolina. And so that is a national issue that, Republicans talk about that matters here. An area where it's maybe a little different is immigration. Obviously, the contemporary Republican Party is focused a lot on immigration. And certainly people here care about that, but I just don't think that it plays as well in the first congressional district as it does in some other parts of the country.
And what quantitative research have you done thus far about that particular district?
About the first congressional district?
Yes, sir.
A fair amount, actually. I mean, so I teach an upper level course on the U.S. Congress at the College of Charleston. And one of the things that my students have done is they've looked at this data set called the CCES data set. It's a big cooperative congressional elections data set where what they do that other polling organizations don't is they get large samples in every single congressional district in the country, all 435 of them. And so what my students have done and what I have done is kind of looked at some of the demographics of voters in the first congressional district. And so, we look at things like the percentage of veterans in the first congressional district. And there are indeed a large number of not only veterans that live here, but veterans that vote here. And so one of the things that Cunningham did, according to some of the analysis that my students and I have done, is he did really, really well among veterans, better than Democrats have traditionally done in the first congressional district. But we also look at data like, what are the percentage of people in the first congressional district that call themselves Republicans or call themselves strong conservatives. And, I think that when we take kind of a steely-eyed look at the data, this really still is a red congressional district. There are more Republicans in this data set than there are Democrats, and there are more people that call themselves strong conservatives in the first congressional district than call themselves strong liberals. And, I think a lot was made about, Cunningham flipping the district for the first time in 40 years. And that was a monumental moment. I think it was driven in part by demographic change here. But what we know is that midterm elections are unique, that they historically are bad for the president's party. And so I was always looking at what happens in 2020. Do we revert back to the normal demographics of the district? And, I don't think it's some big grand narrative. It's not sexy, but I think it was just the fundamentals that matter. I thought Cunningham ran a great campaign. He did everything that he needed to do. Likewise, I thought Nancy Mace ran a great campaign. And so it's not to take anything away from either of them, but, this is still a district that has a lot of Republicans and a lot of strong conservatives. And I think that's what mattered in the congressional election.
What fundamentals does Mr. Cunningham need to run on to win again in, say, 2022?
I would say that I think he needs to continue to do the things that he has done. Again, he did really well with veterans, according to the data that I and my students have looked at. And so continue to talk about issues that are concerning to veterans. Reforming the VA is something that Joe Cunningham has talked a lot about. And frankly, he did some things in Congress that mattered for the VA. Talk about defending military bases and protecting them from closure, from military closure. Of course, there was a discussion during the campaign about Parris Island and what was going to happen to Parris Island. So continue to use his influence on something like that. Continue to talk about flooding and climate change, which, if you believe the scientists, and I certainly do, that's not going anywhere. And, I think continue to stake out a kind of moderate position on things that, the Democratic Party has traditionally done. I mean, I think, I analyzed Joe Cunningham's voting record. I wrote a piece for the City paper analyzing his voting record. He is a bona fide moderate. I mean, in fact, the data indicated something that was a little surprising to me, which is that he's about as moderate as you get when it comes to a Democrat's voting record in Congress. So I don't know that he needs to throw out the playbook. I think he needs to continue to do those things, talk about, local issues that matter. Whatever the future holds for Joe Cunningham, I think he's got a bright future. It could be challenging Mace in 2022 in the midterm election. It could be potentially, being a gubernatorial candidate when McMaster's term is up. It could be something on the national level. I mean, he could potentially have a spot in a Biden administration. I don't know what that would be, but his future is definitely bright.
Now, what playbook and position should Nancy actually use to keep her seat in 2022?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pay attention to what voters in the first congressional district want. Again, I think in not every congressional district in the country is the saying all politics is local true. There are a lot of congressional districts that are so skewed towards one side or the other, or that don't have these defining local issues like flooding and veterans concerns that matter here. So I think she needs a focus on local issues, doing the things that voters in the first congressional district want. And I think if she does that, coupled with the Republican lean of the district, I think she should do pretty well when running for re-election. Of course, she's going to have kind of the opposite of what benefited Cunningham in 2018, which is that in 2022, it's going to be a good year for Republican candidates around the country. So whereas Cunningham was aided by the fact that Donald Trump was president in 2018 and it was a bad year for Republicans nationally, Mace will be benefited in 2022 by the fact that it's probably going to be a bad year for Democrat congressional candidates nationally. And so I expect her to do very, very well in 2022. But again, focusing on local issues, I think, will be one of the keys, one of the things that she can do to help her position.
Dr. Jordan Ragusa, welcome back. Welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups, that is, and thank you so much for your time.
Great. It's an honor. Thank you for interviewing me.
Thank you. Anytime.